I died. And what Jesus showed me about black people changed everything. You won't believe what he revealed. Jessica never thought she'd face death. But in an instant, a medical emergency sent her crashing, straight into the most terrifying, eye-opening experience of her life. She left her body, she saw the other side, and she met Jesus himself. But what he told her, it shook her soul. She saw a truth that has been hidden for centuries, the divine power of black people, the spiritual war keeping them in chains, and the awakening that is already happening. And now, she's sharing it, before it's too late. But there are forces that don't want you to hear this. They've tried to silence her. They've tried to erase this message. But the truth is already out. Watch until the end, because what Jesus revealed about the future will change how you see everything. Do you believe there's a hidden spiritual war? Let me know in the comments. And if you're ready to awaken, subscribe now, because this is just the beginning. Jessica had no reason to suspect that this day would be any different from the rest. The sun hung lazily in the sky as she drove through the familiar streets of her city, humming along to the radio. She had just finished running errands and was heading home, mentally going over her plans for the evening. Life had been stressful, but she had hope. Things were finally starting to come together. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp, searing pain shot through her chest. It was unlike anything she had ever felt before. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead, and a wave of dizziness made the world around her blur. Panic gripped her as she realized something was terribly wrong. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel as she tried to pull over, but her body wasn't responding the way she wanted it to. Her vision darkened at the edges. Her limbs felt heavy, and suddenly, she lost control. The blaring horn of an oncoming truck was the last thing she heard before everything went black. The impact was violent. Her car spun out of control, smashing into a streetlight before flipping onto its side. Bystanders rushed to the scene, their frantic voices blending into a chaotic hum. Jessica's body was motionless, slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling down her forehead. Sirens wailed in the distance as paramedics fought through traffic, racing against time. They worked frantically to pull Jessica from the wreckage, laying her on the cold pavement. One of them checked her pulse and shook his head. "We're losing her," he shouted. They began CPR, pressing down on her chest, trying to force life back into her body. But Jessica wasn't there, not really. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were no longer inside herself. There was no pain, no fear, just an eerie stillness. Then something impossible happened. She was floating. Her consciousness had separated from her body, and she was watching everything unfold from above. She saw her lifeless form lying on the pavement, the paramedics desperately working to revive her. She could hear them, see them, yet she felt no connection to the scene below. A strange glowing mist surrounded her, pulling her gently upward. The chaos of the accident faded into the background, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. Jessica wanted to speak, to reach out, but her voice no longer existed. A force greater than herself was guiding her, drawing her towards something beyond human comprehension. The light ahead grew brighter, almost blinding, yet it didn't hurt her eyes. A deep warmth filled her being, as if she were being embraced by an unseen presence. This was it. She was crossing over. For the first time in her life, Jessica felt truly weightless. The confusion of the accident, the pain, the panic, it was all gone. She was floating effortlessly above the scene, watching the paramedics struggle to bring her back. Their movements looked frantic, their voices distant, as if she were observing through a thick glass. She wanted to feel something, fear, urgency, the will to return. But instead, an overwhelming calm settled over her. She wasn't just outside of her body. She was beyond it. As she hovered, she noticed details she would have never been able to see from the ground. The way the EMT's hand trembled slightly as he pressed the defibrillator to her chest. The concerned look on a bystander's face as they clutched their phone, recording everything. The way the sky seemed different, as if the colors had deepened into something surreal. It was as if she was stepping outside the limits of human perception, seeing the world in a way she had never known possible. Then a force pulled at her, not roughly, but with undeniable strength. She felt herself being drawn upward, away from the chaos, towards something indescribably beautiful. A warm glow surrounded her, and she realized it wasn't just light, it was alive. It pulsed with energy, welcoming her, inviting her forward. With every inch she drifted closer, the peace within her grew. She had never known love like this, a love that wrapped around her like a protective embrace. There was no fear, no sadness, only belonging. Jessica realized she wasn't alone. Shadows moved in the periphery of her vision, figures she couldn't quite make out. She felt their presence, gentle, familiar, loving. Were they loved ones who had passed? Angels? She wasn't sure, but they radiated warmth, as if they had been waiting for her. A soft whisper filled her mind, not in words, but in emotion. You are safe. You are loved. Just as she was about to fully surrender to the light, something shifted, a distant sound, faint at first, then growing louder, a voice calling her name. Urgency rushed through her, but she wasn't the one feeling it. Someone, somewhere, was pulling her back. The warmth wavered, the figures faded, and suddenly, the choice she hadn't realized she had was being made for her. Jessica barely had time to process what was happening before everything around her shifted. The golden light that had been pulling her forward expanded, surrounding her completely. It was as if she had stepped into another realm, one that defied the limits of human understanding. The air was thick with something beyond warmth, beyond peace. It was love in its purest form, a presence so powerful that it made her soul tremble. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even surprised anymore. Deep inside, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Then, she saw him. At first, he was just a silhouette against the endless glow, a figure radiating a light that didn't cast shadows. As he stepped closer, details became clear. His face, his eyes, his expression, and those eyes. They weren't just looking at her. They were looking through her, seeing everything she was, everything she had ever been, every secret, every pain, every joy. She expected to feel ashamed, exposed, but all she felt was love. Pure, unconditional love. Jessica, he spoke, and the sound wasn't just heard, it was felt. His voice carried through her entire being, resonating like a melody she had always known, but had forgotten until this moment. It's not your time yet. The words weren't harsh, but they carried a weight that left no room for argument. A deep knowing settled within her. She had a purpose yet to fulfill. She wanted to question it, to ask why, but before she could, he reached out his hand. In an instant, everything changed. She was no longer standing in the infinite light. She was somewhere else, somewhere vast, limitless. She saw galaxies swirling, rivers of golden energy, flowing like lifeblood through creation itself. Then, the world shifted again, and she was standing on solid ground. But this was no ordinary place. The sky stretched endlessly above her, its color more vibrant than anything on earth. The air itself shimmered. She felt connected to everything, as if she had stepped into the very heartbeat of existence. Jesus stood beside her, his gaze steady. "I have something to show you," he said. And with that, the vision began. The moment Jesus spoke, the world around Jessica shifted once again. she found herself standing high above the earth, looking down as if from the heavens. Below her, the vast continent of Africa stretched out, its lands rich and teeming with life. But this wasn't just a physical vision. She could feel it, the pulse of the land, the deep wisdom carried in the soil, the unbreakable spirit of its people. It was as if she was seeing, not just with her eyes, but with her soul. Then, scenes began to unfold before her, each more vivid than the last. She saw ancient civilizations rising, great kingdoms filled with scholars, warriors, healers, and architects who understood the very fabric of the universe. They moved in harmony with creation, wielding knowledge that had long been forgotten by the modern world. Their connection to the divine was unshaken, their wisdom passed down through generations. They weren't lost, they weren't primitive, they were chosen. And that truth had been hidden for centuries. Jessica turned to Jesus, her heart pounding. "Why?" she asked. "Why was this hidden?" Jesus looked at her, his expression filled with both sorrow and understanding. "Because knowledge is power," he said. "And there are those who fear what would happen if the truth was remembered." Jessica watched as the vision changed. She saw the arrival of forces that sought to break this connection. Conquerors, invaders, men who carried chains both physical and spiritual. She saw the systematic destruction of knowledge, the rewriting of history, the suppression of identity, not just through slavery, but through deception, convincing generations to forget who they were. Tears streamed down Jessica's face. She saw the suffering, the struggles, the resilience of an entire people who had been forced to forget their divine inheritance. But then, something shifted. A new vision emerged. She saw faces awakening, eyes opening to a deeper reality. She saw a great stirring across the world, a movement, an undeniable force, calling people back to their true identity. Jesus placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "It is not lost," he assured her. "The awakening has already begun." Jessica barely had time to process the revelation before the vision shifted again. The warmth of the ancient past faded, and she was plunged into a new scene, one filled with darkness, pain, and sorrow. She saw chains, heavy, rusted iron, wrapped around wrists and ankles, dragging men, women, and children into an existence they never chose. Their cries echoed through time, not just in agony, but in something deeper, a wound that bled across generations. She watched as entire families were torn apart, their histories erased, their names stripped away. But this wasn't just about physical enslavement. This was about something far greater. A thick fog settled over the vision, and suddenly, Jessica felt something pressing down on her. A force, invisible yet suffocating. It was as if an unseen hand was trying to crush the very essence of these people, severing their connection to something sacred. And then she understood. This wasn't just about breaking bodies. It was about breaking spirits. She saw how knowledge was deliberately erased, how stories were rewritten, how faith was manipulated to serve those in power. The very teachings that once empowered were twisted into tools of control, feeding lies that made people forget who they truly were. She turned to Jesus, her voice shaking. How could this happen? His expression was filled with sorrow, but also certainty. Deception, he said, fear, and the desire for control. Jessica watched as false doctrines spread like wildfire, as entire generations were led to believe they were lesser, unworthy, cursed. She saw systems built not just to enslave bodies, but to keep minds in bondage long after the chains were removed. Even in freedom, the oppression continued, through poverty, through division, through the quiet, persistent whisper that told them they were not enough. Yet in the midst of this darkness, something else flickered. A light, small at first, but unyielding. She saw people who resisted, who remembered, who carried ancient wisdom in their blood. Even when the world told them to forget, she saw spiritual warriors who never surrendered, who spoke truths that others tried to silence. The vision shifted once more, and she saw the present day, millions beginning to question, to search, to reclaim the knowledge that had been hidden for so long. Jesus turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "The battle is not over," he said, "but the awakening has begun." Jessica felt a shift in the air, like the turning of a page in a book, written long before time began. The darkness that had once consumed her vision was lifting, giving way to something new, something powerful. She stood on the edge of a vast horizon, watching as light began to rise, illuminating the faces of those who had once been lost in the shadows. It was happening. The awakening had begun. Before her, she saw people, millions of them, scattered across the world. At first, they moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes dull, their shoulders weighed down by burdens they had carried for generations. But then, one by one, their eyes opened. The moment was subtle at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but then it spread like wildfire. They began to see, to remember. The chains, those invisible shackles of doubt, fear, and false identity, began to crumble. Jesus stood beside her, his presence unwavering. "For too long the truth has been buried," he said, "but the time has come for my people to rise." Jessica watched as knowledge, once hidden, began to resurface. Forgotten histories were uncovered. Spiritual gifts, long suppressed, began to awaken. She saw visions of Black men and women stepping into their power, not through force, but through wisdom, faith, and divine purpose. They were no longer waiting for permission to reclaim what was theirs. They were taking it back. But with revelation came resistance. She saw the struggle, the pushback from a world that thrived on deception. Governments, institutions, even religious leaders. Many fought to suppress this awakening, to silence the voices that dared to speak the truth. She saw distractions being thrown like weapons. Division, materialism, fear, all designed to keep people from seeing the full picture. Yet no matter how hard the opposition tried, they could not stop what had already begun. Jessica turned to Jesus, her heart pounding. "What happens next?" she asked. He looked at her with a certainty that sent chills through her soul. "The battle will be fierce," he said, "but my people will not fail. The truth cannot be undone. The light will always outshine the darkness." As he spoke, she saw the future, a generation fully awakened, standing in their power, walking in their purpose. They were no longer bound. They were free, and nothing would ever be the same again. Jessica gasped as she opened her eyes, her lungs burning as if she had been holding her breath for an eternity. The sterile glow of hospital lights replaced the divine radiance she had just witnessed. The weight of her physical body felt suffocating, almost foreign. Machines beeped around her, tubes ran along her arms, and a nurse rushed to call the doctor. She was alive, but something inside her had changed forever. In the days that followed, she tried to speak about what she had seen. At first, she shared cautiously, with close friends, family, people she thought would understand. But the reactions were not what she expected. Some dismissed her entirely, waving it off as a hallucination. Others listened with unease, their expressions shifting between doubt and fear. Even those who believed in near-death experiences hesitated when she spoke about Jesus, revealing the hidden truth about Black people. "Be careful with what you're saying," one friend warned. "Not everyone wants that truth to be known." Then, the disturbances began. It started small, files mysteriously disappearing from her computer, phone calls dropping in the middle of conversations. Emails she had sent with details of her experience never reached their recipients. Social media posts about her testimony were flagged, removed, or met with a flood of hostile comments. But the real terror came at night. She would wake up to the feeling of something watching her, an unseen presence lurking in the darkness. Whispers echoed in her room. Though she was alone, shadows moved where no shadows should be. The attacks weren't just digital or psychological. Strange occurrences plagued her daily life. Her car alarm would go off without reason. Doors in her home would be found open when she was certain she had locked them. And then there were the nightmares. Visions of faceless figures trying to silence her. Hands reaching out from the void to pull her back into the darkness. Each time she woke up, she could feel the battle waging around her. A war she hadn't asked to fight, but could no longer ignore. Despite the fear, Jessica knew one thing. She had seen the truth. And if forces were working this hard to silence her, that only meant one thing. The message she carried was powerful. She had a choice: retreat into silence, or stand firm and share what she had been shown, no matter the cost. And deep down, she knew there was no turning back. Jessica had always believed in the unseen, but never like this. The attacks against her weren't just random obstacles. They were strategic, precise, designed to break her spirit. Every time she spoke out, something tried to shut her down. Every time she prayed, the pressure intensified. It wasn't just skepticism from people. It was something darker, something relentless. A force that didn't want this truth to be known. One night, as she knelt in prayer, a suffocating heaviness filled the room. The air grew thick, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. It was as if something was there with her, watching, waiting. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Then, in the silence, a voice, not audible, but felt, whispered, "Stop. You don't know what you're dealing with." Fear gripped her for a moment, but then something deeper rose within her. A fire, a knowing. This was not just resistance. This was war. She remembered what Jesus had told her. The battle will be fierce, but my people will not fail. That battle wasn't just about systems of oppression or hidden histories. It was about spiritual control, keeping people asleep, disconnected from their divine identity. She saw it now. The distractions, the fear, the manipulation. It wasn't just history that had been erased. It was power. The kind of power that could change the world if people only woke up. Determined, she armed herself. Not with weapons, but with prayer, fasting, and unwavering faith. She studied scripture like never before, searching for the deeper meanings, the hidden truths buried beneath years of distortion. The more she learned, the clearer it became. This wasn't a battle she could fight alone. She needed others, those who had also felt the stirring, those who knew there was more beyond what they had been taught. The more she pressed forward, the harder the attacks became. Strange illnesses, financial troubles, even unexpected betrayals from people she once trusted. But through it all, she held on to one truth. If the enemy was fighting this hard to stop her, it only meant her mission was more important than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about Jessica. This was about an entire generation rising, and no force in hell could stop what had already begun. As Jessica pressed deeper into prayer, another vision consumed her. It was unlike anything she had seen before. Vivid, overwhelming, and urgent. She was no longer in her room. She was standing on the edge of a great battlefield, watching as two forces clashed in a war that stretched beyond the physical realm. This was not just a war of nations. It was a war of truth versus deception, of light versus darkness. and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. On one side, she saw those who had awakened, the ones who had broken free from the lies, who had reclaimed their divine identity. They stood strong, not with weapons, but with wisdom, with faith, with an unshakable understanding of who they were. They glowed with a radiant light, and as they spoke, their words broke chains, shattered illusions, and freed those still trapped in ignorance. They were unstoppable, but the other side was just as fierce. Jessica saw rulers, institutions, and unseen spiritual forces desperately clinging to power. They spread fear, division, and confusion, using every tool at their disposal to keep the masses blind. Media, government, even religion. Everything was being used as a weapon to maintain control. And when deception no longer worked, chaos erupted. She saw protests turning violent, cities burning, the world shaking under the weight of its own corruption. Natural disasters, political turmoil, economic collapse. It was all happening at once, as if the entire planet was groaning under the weight of this great shift. Jessica's heart pounded as she turned to see Jesus standing beside her, his face solemn. "Is this the end?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No," he replied. "This is the breaking. The awakening will not come without struggle, but in the end, the truth will stand, and nothing will be able to hide it again." Then, the vision shifted once more. The chaos faded, and in its place, she saw something new. A world unlike the one she had known. A world where people lived in their true identity, where deception no longer ruled, where wisdom and love were the foundations of society. She saw leaders who served instead of controlled, families restored, communities thriving in unity. It wasn't perfect, but it was free. And in that moment, Jessica understood. The war wasn't about destruction. It was about rebirth. When the vision ended, Jessica gasped for air, her body trembling. She had seen what was coming, and now, more than ever, she knew what she had to do. Jessica sat in stunned silence, the weight of the vision pressing on her soul, like a fire that refused to be extinguished. She had seen the truth, felt it in every fiber of her being. There was no going back, no pretending she hadn't witnessed the war, the deception, the great awakening that was unfolding. She turned to Jesus, her voice trembling. "What do I do now?" His gaze was steady, filled with both love and urgency. "Tell them," he said. "Speak the truth, no matter the cost. Many will resist, many will try to silence you, but those who are meant to hear will listen. And once they awaken, nothing will stop them." Jessica saw it, her mission unfolding before her. She would be attacked, ridiculed, called crazy. She would lose friends, face opposition from the very system she had once trusted. But she would not be alone. She saw others, voices rising, people stepping into their divine calling, refusing to be silenced. She saw a movement growing, unstoppable like a tidal wave. Black men and women reclaiming their spiritual power, remembering who they were, breaking free from the mental and spiritual chains that had bound them for centuries. "But what about the distractions?" she asked. "The forces working against us." Jesus gave her a knowing look. "They will come," he said. "They will use fear, division, materialism, anything to keep people asleep. But those who truly seek will find the truth. And once they do, no deception can hold them anymore." Jessica's heart burned with purpose. This wasn't just about her. It was about an entire generation waking up, stepping into their power, preparing for the war ahead. "I will tell them," she whispered. "I will warn them." And with those words, she felt the final pieces of her old self fall away. She was no longer the woman who had died in that car accident. She had been reborn, transformed by a truth too powerful to ignore. This was only the beginning. What if everything you've been told about your history, your power, and your purpose has been a lie? The awakening has begun, and now the question is, will you wake up or stay blind to the truth? Jesus revealed what's coming. The battle is already here, but you don't have to fight it alone. Do you believe Black people have a hidden spiritual power? Have you ever felt like there's more to your purpose? Let's talk in the comments. And if this message spoke to you, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning. The truth is coming out, and you don't want to miss what happens next.